Before there was Amazon, before there was Walmart, and before organic was a buzzword, there was A&P. At its peak, it wasn't just a grocery store, it was the largest retailer in the world, a titan so powerful that the US government actually tried to break it up. They invented the price tag, the supermarket aisle, and the very idea of a house brand. They were the kings of modern America. But in a world they built, they eventually became the first great victim of the retail wars. Today, we're uncovering how the most successful business in history vanished into thin air, and the one fatal mistake that paved the way for Walmart to take the throne.
About the brand, the red and gold empire. To understand A&P, you have to understand its identity. For over a century, the bright red storefronts with gold lettering were a symbol of the American middle class. The brand stood for two things: affordability and efficiency. They were the first to prove that you could make a fortune by selling high volumes at a low profit margin. Their house brands, like Ann Page and Jane Parker, were staples in every pantry. To shop at A&P was to participate in the American dream of abundance. But beneath that red and gold veneer was a complex, vertically integrated machine, a company that owned its own canneries, bakeries, and even its own salmon fishing fleet. A&P wasn't just a store, it was a sovereign industrial power. The founders, Gilman and Hartford. The seeds of this empire were planted in 1859. George Gilman, a wealthy leather tanner, decided to pivot into a more respectable business: tea. At the time, tea was a luxury, passed through dozens of middlemen who each added a markup. Gilman had a radical idea: cut the middlemen out. He began buying tea directly from the clipper ships arriving in New York Harbor. To help him run the business, he hired a hard-working young man named George Huntington Hartford. While Gilman was the master of promotion, painting his storefronts red and gold to grab attention, Hartford was the master of operations. Together, they founded Gilman and Company, which would soon become the Great American Tea Company. By 1863, the company was no longer just a wholesaler, it was a retailer with 5 stores in Manhattan. They specialized in high-volume, low-cost tea and coffee. Their early success was driven by a mail-order business. Gilman realized that families in rural America were paying exorbitant prices for stale tea at local general stores. By utilizing the new national mail system, they could ship fresh tea directly to tea clubs in small towns across the country. They were effectively the first e-commerce pioneers of the 19th century. The birth of the A&P name. In 1869, a historic event shook the nation: the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. Gilman and Hartford saw the symbolic power of this achievement. They renamed their firm the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company. The name wasn't just a geographical boast, it was a brand promise. It suggested a company that spanned the entire continent, bringing the riches of the world to the local neighborhood. It was one of the brilliant marketing moves in retail history, elevating a tea shop into a national institution. Premiums and promotion, the Gilman way. George Gilman was a master of the gimmick. In 1871, he introduced premiums. With every purchase of tea or coffee, customers received a gift: colorful lithographs, glassware, or fine china. Women across America began to frequent A&P not just for the food, but to collect entire sets of dinnerware. These premiums created a level of brand loyalty that was unheard of in the 1870s. Gilman understood that to win the market, you didn't just sell a product, you sold a reward. The Hartford takeover. In 1878, George Gilman retired, leaving the business in the hands of George Huntington Hartford. This was the moment the company transitioned from a promotional venture into a disciplined corporate machine. Hartford wasn't just a merchant, he was a visionary. He began to expand the company's offerings beyond tea and coffee, adding sugar, spices, and condensed milk. But his greatest contribution was his family. His 2 sons, George Lublin and John Augustine Hartford, would grow up within the aisles of A&P, eventually leading the company to heights that Gilman could never have imagined. The move to the heartland.
After the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, A&P did something unexpected. They sent massive donations of food and a small staff to help the city. This act of corporate charity opened the door to the Midwest. By 1880, A&P had 100 stores. They were no longer just a New York curiosity, they were a regional power. They were proving that the chain store model, where every store looked the same, sold the same goods, and shared the same low-price strategy, could work on a massive scale. The Goliath was beginning to walk.
The revolutionary explosion. The second generation, George and John. By the turn of the 20th century, A&P was at a crossroads. The elder Hartford was aging, and the world was changing. It was time for his sons to step into the light. John Augustine Hartford and George Ludlam Hartford were the yin and yang of American retail. George, the elder, was the Minister of Finance. He was reclusive, analytical, and obsessed with the books. John, the younger, was the merchant prince. He was a marketing genius who spent his days visiting stores and talking to customers. Together, they formed a partnership that would turn a regional chain into a global juggernaut. It was their combined vision that would soon realize the old way of selling food was dead. 1912, the economy store revolution. Before 1912, grocery shopping was a luxury service. Stores offered credit, home delivery, and high-end decor, all of which made food incredibly expensive. John Hartford had a radical idea. He told his father, "Give me one store. I want to strip away the delivery wagons, end the credit accounts, and stop giving away premiums." He opened the first A&P economy store in Jersey City. It was bare bones and functioned on a cash-and-carry basis. Because John had removed the overhead costs, he could slash prices to levels the competition couldn't touch. The results were explosive. That single store did more business in its first week than 3 traditional stores combined. The revolution had begun. The viral expansion. Once the economy store model was proven, A&P didn't just grow, it mutated. Between 1912 and 1915, they opened an average of 1 new store every 3 days. By 1916, they had 3,000 stores. They looked for high-traffic corners in working-class neighborhoods. Every store was a cookie-cutter replica of the last. Same layout, same red front, same low prices. This was the birth of standardized retail. For the first time in history, a consumer in Ohio could walk into a store and find the exact same products at the exact same price as a consumer in New York. Vertical integration, becoming the manufacturer. A&P realized that if they wanted to keep prices low, they couldn't just negotiate with manufacturers, they had to become the manufacturers. They began a process called vertical integration. They built the world's largest milk condensing plant. They opened massive bakeries that produced Jane Parker bread. They even operated their own salmon canneries in Alaska and their own printing presses for their advertisements. By owning the factories, the warehouses, and the stores, they eliminated every possible middleman. A&P was now a closed-loop economy, a titan that produced what it sold. The Coffee King, 8 o'clock coffee. Of all their private labels, one stood above the rest, 8 o'clock coffee. By the 1920s, A&P was the largest coffee importer in the world. Every A&P store featured a large red mechanical grinder. The smell of freshly ground beans became the signature scent of the brand. By selling their own coffee, they could offer a premium product for 25% less than the national brands. 8 o'clock coffee wasn't just a product, it was a hook that brought millions of people through the doors every single morning. World War I and the Great Price Wrecker. World War I brought massive inflation. The price of eggs, flour, and meat doubled in months. For most Americans, the local mom-and-pop grocery was becoming unaffordable. A&P stepped in as the Great Price Wrecker. Because of their massive buying power and lack of middlemen, they held their prices steady while others surged. This cemented A&P's reputation as the friend of the working man. By the time the war ended in 1918, A&P had 5,000 stores and had become a permanent part of the American social fabric. 1929, the billion-dollar milestone. In 1929, the year the stock market crashed, A&P achieved the impossible. They became the first retail merchant in human history to reach $1 billion in annual sales. To put that in perspective, in 1929, that was roughly 10% of the entire American grocery budget. They had 15,000 stores. They were larger than Ford and General Motors in terms of reach. They were the Walmart, the Amazon, and the McDonald's of their time, all rolled into one. At this moment, A&P was the most powerful corporation on the planet. The arrival of the combination store. As the 1920s roared on, the Hartfords realized that the simple dry goods tea shop was no longer enough. People wanted one-stop shopping. They began converting their stores into combination stores. They added fresh meat departments with on-site butchers and produce sections with misted vegetables. It was the final step before the invention of the supermarket. A&P was no longer just a place for tea and coffee. It was a place where a family could buy their entire life's sustenance under one roof. They had conquered the kitchen.
The supermarket era and the antitrust storm. When the Great Depression struck in 1929, the American economy didn't just stumble, it collapsed. But for A&P, the catastrophe was, perversely, an opportunity. As families lost their savings and unemployment soared to 25%, the economy store model became a national lifeline. John and George Hartford made a strategic decision. They would keep profit margins at an absolute minimum, sometimes as low as 1%, to ensure that even the poorest families could afford bread and milk. While thousands of independent grocers went bankrupt, A&P's volume actually increased. They weren't just a store anymore, they were a vital utility. During the darkest days of the 1930s, the Red Front A&P was the only place where a nickel still felt like a dollar. The King Cullen threat. Success often breeds complacency, and even the Hartfords weren't immune. In 1930, a former A&P employee named Michael Cullen sent a letter to the Hartfords. He had a radical idea: build massive 50,000-square-foot stores in low-rent areas with huge parking lots. He called them supermarkets. The Hartfords ignored his letter. They were happy with their 15,000 small neighborhood stores. Undeterred, Cullen opened King Cullen in Queens, New York. It was a sensation. People drove for miles to shop there, lured by even lower prices and the novelty of self-service, where you pushed a cart yourself. Suddenly, A&P's thousands of small stores looked like a liability, expensive to staff and impossible to modernize. The hunter was becoming the hunted. The pivot to the supermarket. It took John Hartford 3 years to realize his mistake, but once he did, he moved with the speed of a tidal wave. Between 1936 and 1940, A&P performed one of the most drastic corporate pivots in history. They began closing their small neighborhood economy stores by the thousands. In their place, they built A&P supermarkets. In just 4 years, A&P's store count dropped from 15,000 tiny shops to about 6,000 massive supermarkets. Paradoxically, as their store count fell, their sales and profits reached record highs. They had successfully cannibalized their own empire to survive the future. The Robinson-Patman Act, the government attacks. A&P had become so efficient and so large that it was terrifying the American establishment. Local mom-and-pop grocers complained that they couldn't compete with A&P's predatory pricing. In 1936, the government stepped in with the Robinson-Patman Act, often called the Anti-Chain Store Act. It was designed specifically to stop A&P from using its massive buying power to demand lower prices from suppliers. For the first time, the Goliath was being dragged into a courtroom. The government wasn't just questioning A&P's business, it was questioning the very idea of a retail monopoly. The Great Antitrust Trial. In 1944, the U.S. Department of Justice filed a massive antitrust suit against A&P. The charge was that A&P's vertical integration, owning the factories and the stores, allowed them to engage in unfair competition. The trial lasted years. The government argued that A&P was too big. The Hartfords countered with a simple, powerful argument: "We have lowered the cost of living for the American people." To the Hartfords, being big wasn't a crime, it was a service. They weren't just fighting for their company, they were fighting for the right to be efficient. Woman's Day, the secret weapon. During the legal battles, A&P launched a brilliant cultural offensive. In 1937, they created Woman's Day magazine. Originally sold only in A&P stores, it was filled with recipes that used A&P private label products. It became one of the most popular magazines in America. By teaching a generation of housewives how to cook and manage a home through their magazine, A&P embedded itself in the American psyche. They weren't just a grocery store, they were a lifestyle brand before the term existed. World War II and the essential empire. During World War II, A&P's massive infrastructure was put to the service of the war effort. They became a primary distributor of food for the military and a key player in the government's rationing program. Despite the shortages of meat and sugar, A&P's efficiency kept the civilian population fed. By 1945, the company was viewed not as a corporate villain, but as an essential national asset. They emerged from the war as the undisputed king of American commerce, with a reputation for patriotism and reliability. The peak 1950. And the death of the kings. By 1950, A&P was at the summit. Sales hit nearly $3 billion. They were the second largest company in America, trailing only General Motors. But at the moment of their greatest triumph, the lineage failed. John Hartford died in 1951, and his brother George followed in 1957. For nearly 90 years, the Hartford family had provided the vision and the iron will that drove A&P. Now, for the first time, the red and gold empire was without a Hartford. The crown was passed to a group of aging executives who had spent their lives following orders, not giving them. The era of innovation was over. The era of management had begun. Stagnation and the slow decay. When the Hartford brothers died, they didn't just leave a company, they left a vacuum. The new leadership was composed of company men, executives who had started as clerks in the 1920s. They revered the Hartford way so much that they refused to change it, even as the world outside their tinted windows moved into the space age. While the rest of America was moving to the suburbs and demanding large, bright, air-conditioned wonderlands, A&P's leadership stayed obsessed with the small, urban footprints that had worked in the 1930s. They were managing a memory, not a business. The Goliath wasn't dying, it was falling asleep. The suburban shift, missing the bus. The 1950s and 60s saw the greatest migration in American history, the flight to the suburbs. New competitors like Safeway and Kroger followed the families. They built stores with 20 aisles, massive frozen food sections, and parking lots for hundreds of cars. A&P stayed behind in the crumbling city centers. Their stores were cramped, their ceilings were low, and their parking was non-existent. To the new suburban housewife, A&P felt like her grandmother's store, reliable but old, dark, and inconvenient. By the time A&P realized the suburbs were the future, the best real estate had already been snatched up by their rivals. The private label trap. For decades, A&P's vertical integration was its greatest strength, but in the age of television advertising, it became a weakness. Consumers were being bombarded with ads for national brands like Coca-Cola and Tide. A&P, obsessed with its own profits, continued to give prime shelf space to its own house brands. If a customer wanted the cool new cereal they saw on TV, they often couldn't find it at A&P. The store that had once brought the world to the neighborhood was now seen as a place that limited choice. The closed-loop economy had become a closed-mind economy. Labor strife and the cost of history. Because A&P was the oldest chain, it had the most senior workforce. This meant higher wages, more vacation time, and massive pension liabilities. Newer chains were opening with younger, cheaper, non-union labor in the South and West. A&P was trapped in the high-cost, heavily unionized Northeast. Every time they tried to modernize or close an inefficient store, they faced brutal strikes. The family company was now at war with its own employees, and the cost of doing business was spiraling out of control. 1972, the WEO disaster. By 1972, A&P was in a tailspin. In a desperate attempt to regain market share, the new CEO, William Kane, launched the WEO, Where Economy Originates campaign. It was a scorched earth price war. A&P slashed prices on thousands of items below cost. They hoped to starve out the competition. It worked. Sort of. Sales went up, but A&P lost $50 million in a single year. It was a suicidal move. They damaged their own brand, making it look cheap and desperate, while their competitors simply waited for A&P to bleed out. The Tengelmann takeover. By 1979, the once proud American icon was a bargain basement carcass. The Tengelmann Group, a German retail giant, saw an opportunity. They bought a majority stake in A&P, hoping to apply European efficiency to American scale. The Germans brought in new management and a wave of closures. They shut down hundreds of zombie stores. For a moment, the bleeding stopped, but the cultural gap was too wide. The Germans didn't understand the American obsession with experience over price. They continued to cut costs when they should have been investing in the shopping experience. The acquisition binge, papering over the cracks. Throughout the 80s and 90s, A&P tried to buy its way back to growth. They acquired regional chains like Waldbaum's and Pathmark. On paper, it made them look like a giant again, but beneath the surface, it was a mess. They had a dozen different brands, a dozen different supply chains, and no unified identity. They were a Frankenstein's monster of retail. Instead of fixing the A&P brand, they were just adding more failing stores to the pile. The rise of the new titans. While A&P was busy merging with other struggling 20th century brands, the 21st century arrived with a vengeance. Walmart brought the high-tech logistics that A&P had invented but forgotten. Whole Foods took the high-end customers who wanted organic quality. Trader Joe's took the young, urban shoppers. A&P was left in the mushy middle, not cheap enough to beat Walmart, not fancy enough to beat Whole Foods, and not cool enough to beat Trader Joe's. They were a company without a country. The final collapse and the lasting echo. The debt trap and the 2010 bankruptcy. By the mid-2000s, A&P was no longer a grocery company. It was a debt management company that happened to sell food. The acquisition of Pathmark in 2007, intended to be a masterstroke, turned into a financial noose. They had paid $1.3 billion for a competitor, while the global economy was on the brink of the Great Recession. In December 2010, the unthinkable happened. The Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The titan that had survived the 1929 crash couldn't survive the 2008 credit crunch. They emerged in 2012 as a private company, but the surgery had been brutal. To pay off creditors, they had sold their crown jewel, 8 O'Clock Coffee, to Tata Global Beverages. They had sold their soul to save their skin. The final spiral, 2012 to 2015. The post-bankruptcy years were a slow-motion tragedy. The company was now owned by hedge funds and investment firms that cared more about asset liquidation than apples and oranges. Inventory levels began to drop because A&P couldn't pay its suppliers on time. Customers would walk in for milk and eggs only to find empty shelves. In the grocery business, once you lose the customer's trust that you'll have what they need, you lose the customer forever. By 2015, A&P was losing $30 million every single month. The Great Atlantic and Pacific had shrunk to a small, struggling cluster of stores in the Northeast. The fall, July 19, 2015. On July 19, 2015, the curtain finally fell. A&P filed for bankruptcy for the second and final time. This time, there would be no reorganization, no white knight from Germany, no Hartford descendant to save the day. The court ordered a total liquidation. The remaining 296 stores were sold off to competitors like Acme, Stop and Shop, and Key Food, or simply shuttered. For the 28,000 employees, many of whom had spent 30 or 40 years in the red and gold, it was the end of a life's work. On a Tuesday in November 2015, the very last A&P store turned off its lights. 156 years of history ended with the turn of a key. Why did they fail? The post-mortem. How does the world's most powerful retailer die? It wasn't one single mistake, but a toxic cocktail of 3 failures. The real estate trap. They stayed in small, expensive urban locations while the world moved to the suburbs. Managerial hubris. They were so obsessed with the Hartford way that they stopped innovating. They became a bureaucracy instead of a business. The middle ground curse. They lost their price advantage to Walmart and their quality advantage to Whole Foods. If you aren't the cheapest and you aren't the best, you are nothing. The ghost of retail past. A&P failed as a business, but it succeeded in creating the world we live in today. Every time you walk into a supermarket and find a bakery, a pharmacy, and a meat counter under one roof, you were walking through a dream John Hartford had in 1930. Every time you buy a store brand product that is just as good as the national name, you are benefiting from the trail blazed by Ann Page and Jane Parker. A&P was the operating system for modern retail. The hardware finally broke, but the software is still running in every grocery store on the planet.
Legacy and lessons for the future. The story of A&P is a warning to the giants of today. It tells us that size is no shield against stagnation. In 1950, people thought A&P was too big to fail. Today, we say the same about Amazon or Walmart. But the lesson of the Hartfords is that retail is a living thing. It requires constant, ruthless evolution. The moment you stop being the great wrecker of prices and start being the protector of the status quo, your expiration date is set. The 8 o'clock echo. There is one small part of the empire that refused to die. If you go into almost any grocery store today, you will still find 8 o'clock coffee. It is a survivor, a lone remnant of a $15 billion empire. It serves as a daily reminder of a time when the red and gold was the king of the American road. It is the last living link to the 2 brothers from Maine who taught a nation how to shop. The Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company didn't just sell groceries, it built the infrastructure of the American dream. It fed a nation through depressions and wars, it challenged the government, and it pioneered the convenience we now take for granted. Its buildings may be repurposed, and its logos may be gone, but the spirit of A&P lives on in every shopping cart in the world. They were the first, they were the greatest, and in the end, they were a reminder that even the mightiest empires eventually return to the dust. For 156 years, they were the Great Atlantic and Pacific. Now, they belong to history.